the Duke of Thornwood did not look at his wife. He never did. And tonight, standing beneath the glittering chandeliers of Ashford Hall, Evelina Thornwood finally stopped hopping he would. She stood at the edge of the ballroom in a gown the color of faded roses, her gloved hands folded so tightly that the seams bit into her palms. Around her, the music swelled, violins weaving through laughter and murmured gossip. No one approached her. No one ever did. She was the Duchess of Thornwood, yet she existed in a circle of silence, as though the world had agreed to pretend she was not there. Her husband, Alexander Blackwood, stood across the room with his back partially turned to her, deep in conversation with Lady Caroline Pemberton. Caroline's golden hair caught the candlelight like spun sugar, and every time she laughed, she touched Alexander's arm with the casual intimacy of a woman who had never known rejection. Evelina watched that touch. She watched Alexander's cold, beautiful face, searching for the flicker of warmth he never gave her. There was none. There had never been any. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of sleeping in a separate chamber. 3 years of polite greetings at breakfast, of stiff dances at obligatory balls, of her heart slowly splintering in the quiet of Thornwood Hall. She had arrived at that altar hopeful, naive, believing she could thaw the ice around the Duke's heart. She had left that hope in 1,000 small pieces, scattered across dinners eaten alone and anniversaries he forgot. A familiar ache pressed against her ribs, but tonight something else stirred beneath it. Something tired, something that whispered no more. She turned her gaze from her husband and looked toward the terrace doors. The night air called to her, cool and honest. She slipped through the crowd, a ghost in silk, and stepped outside. The terrace was empty. Below, the gardens lay silver under a half-moon. Evelina pressed her hands against the stone balustrade and let the cold seep into her fingers. She had spent so long trying to become the wife he might one day want. She had studied his interests, managed his household impeccably, never complained, never demanded. She had loved him with a quiet desperation that shamed her now. And it had earned her nothing. "I am done," she whispered to the night. The words tasted like ash and freedom. "I will not beg for love any longer." She did not cry. She had no tears left. Instead, a strange, hollow peace settled over her. She would stop seeking his gaze across crowded rooms. She would stop waiting for footsteps that never came. She would become a duchess in title only and build a life around the empty space where her husband should have been. The decision felt like laying down a heavy stone. She stayed on the terrace until the cold became too sharp, then returned inside. Alexander had not noticed her absence. He was still beside Lady Caroline, and now his hand rested briefly at her elbow, guiding her toward the dance floor. Evelina walked past them without looking. She collected her cloak, summoned her carriage, and went home alone. Thornwood Hall was a vast, beautiful prison made of gray stone and ancient oaks. Its corridors echoed. Evelina's footsteps were the only sound as she made her way to her private sitting room. She removed her gloves slowly, laying them on the table like a farewell to the evening. She did not wait up for Alexander. She did not wonder when he would return. The next morning she woke to gray light and a decision already formed in her mind. She would not waste another day aching for what she could not have. There was an entire estate full of people who needed her, tenants, villagers, the orphanage at the edge of Thornwood land that had been neglected for years. She had been so consumed by her marriage that she had forgotten her own power. She was a duchess. She could do something with that title besides mourn. After a quiet breakfast alone, she sent for the estate steward. Mr. Hartley arrived with a ledger and a nervous bow. He was a thin, anxious man who had served the Thornwood family for decades. When she asked for a full report on the tenant farms and the charitable funds, he blinked at her in surprise. The previous Duchess, Alexander's mother, had passed long ago. No one had expected the new Duchess to take an interest. "I wish to visit the holdings personally," Evelina said, her voice calm but firm. "And I want a list of every family in need on this estate." "Your Grace, the Duke has never." "The Duke is occupied with other matters," she said, and the words came without bitterness. Simply truth. I am not. By the end of the week, Evelina had visited 12 farms, 3 mills, and the small, damp orphanage that housed 30 children in worn clothes. She left each place with notes, promises, and a quiet fire in her chest. The tenants looked at her with guarded hope. They were not accustomed to kindness from Thornwood Hall. The orphan children clung to her skirts, and she knelt in the mud to speak to them, heedless of her fine dress. She began to spend her days away from the manor. She ordered repairs for leaking roofs, arranged for medical supplies, sat with elderly tenants who had no one else. She was exhausted at night, but it was a good exhaustion, earned and clean. Alexander noticed nothing. He was in London often, attending Parliament or spending long hours at his club. When he was home, he remained in his study or rode the estate alone. They passed each other like ships in fog. Evelina no longer paused hoping he would speak. She simply nodded politely and continued on her way. One evening, 6 weeks after the ball, she returned from the village later than usual. Dusk had painted the sky violet. Her gown was dusty, her hair escaping its pins. As she walked through the main hall, she found Alexander standing by the staircase, an unreadable expression on his face. "You were gone all day," he said. It was not a question. Evelina paused, surprised. He had never commented on her whereabouts before. "I was in the village. There was a problem at the mill." He studied her as if seeing a stranger. "I have a steward for such things." "I am aware." She met his gaze steadily. "But I prefer to see for myself." Silence stretched between them. For a single, fleeting moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his gray eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. But it passed. He gave a curt nod and walked away. Evelina stood there for a moment, her heart beating faster than it should. She pressed a hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe. One comment did not change anything. She would not let it. But as she climbed the stairs to her chamber, she could not shake the feeling that, for the first time in 3 years, her husband had actually looked at her. Spring melted into early summer. The Thornwood lands began to bloom, and so, in a quiet way, did Evelina. Her face lost its pale, pinched look. She laughed sometimes, genuinely, when the village children presented her with wilting flowers or when old Mrs. Thistle told stories of her youth. She slept better. The hollow ache in her chest did not vanish, but it shrank, crowded out by purpose. She stopped attending every social event. When she did appear, she no longer stood at the edges waiting for Alexander's attention. She danced with elderly gentlemen, talked politics with the local clergy, spent hours discussing agriculture with landowners. People began to notice her, not as the Duke's neglected wife, but as the Duchess of Thornwood in her own right. And Alexander began to notice too. It started with small things. He came home one afternoon to find the drawing room filled with baskets of bread and cloth, intended for the orphanage. Evelina was directing servants calmly, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. He stopped in the doorway, frowning. "What is all this?" "Donations," she said without looking up. "The children need new blankets before autumn. And this is your responsibility because I made it so." She finally looked at him, and there was no defiance in her eyes, only quiet certainty. Someone must care for them. Something tightened in his jaw. He said nothing more and left. Another time, he saw her walking back from the tenant cottages with a basket over her arm, her bonnet pulled low against the sun. One of the village men, a broad-shouldered farmer named Thomas Hale, walked beside her. He was laughing at something she said, and she was smiling. Alexander stood at the window of his study, watching them. His hand tightened around the glass in his grip. Thomas Hale had no business walking so close to a duchess, no business making her smile like that. The thought startled him. He forced himself to turn away, but the image lingered, a burr beneath his skin. That night at dinner, he broke their usual silence. I saw you with one of the tenants today." Evelina looked up from her soup. "Mr. Hale. He was showing me the damage to the East Field drainage." It seemed friendly. She set down her spoon slowly. "He is a good man, he works hard." "He is a tenant." "I am aware." Her voice was cool. "Is there a point to this observation, Your Grace?" He did not miss the formality. "Your Grace." She had called him by his title for months now, never his name. He had not realized until this moment how much he loathed it. "No," he said stiffly, "no point." They finished the meal in a silence heavier than before. June brought the annual Thornwood Summer Fete, a tradition held on the manor lawns for the entire county. Evelina threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised everyone, including herself. She organized games, food, music. She invited the orphan children to perform a small play. She was everywhere, directing, helping, laughing with the servants as if they were friends. Alexander watched from the periphery. He saw how his Duchess moved through the crowd, graceful and warm. He saw how people gravitated toward her, how the tenants' wariness had transformed into genuine affection. He saw the way she knelt to speak to a crying child, the way she brushed dirt from a farmer's coat with unthinking kindness. Who was this woman? She had been in his house for 3 years and he had never truly seen her. He had married her because he had to, because the king had commanded it to settle the bad blood between their families. Her father, Lord Ashworth, had been accused of embezzling crown funds and implicated in the scandal that ruined Alexander's own father, the previous duke. The marriage was meant to bind wounds, but Alexander had only seen it as a fresh one. He had looked at his bride and seen only her father's treachery. He had been cold, deliberately. He had wanted her to feel the distance as a punishment for sins not her own. And she had borne it. For 3 years she had borne it without complaint, until she stopped, until she turned away and poured all that withheld affection into strangers. Now, watching her lift a little girl onto her hip with effortless tenderness, he felt something crack open inside his chest. A raw, ugly feeling he did not want to name. Jealousy. Of a child, of a tenant farmer, of anyone who received her smile. And beneath it, deeper and more frightening, a dawning sense of regret. The fate was a triumph. Evelina stood at the end of the day, tired and happy, accepting compliments from neighbors and thanks from villagers. Lady Caroline Pemberton was there, and she spent the entire afternoon attached to Alexander's arm, but Evelina barely glanced at them. It no longer stung. That in itself was a victory. As the last guests departed and the servants began clearing away, she walked toward the house, her feet aching. She was almost to the terrace when a voice stopped her. "Evelina." She turned. Lord Nathaniel Croft stood near the rose trellis, a glass of lemonade in his hand and a soft smile on his lips. He was tall and fair-haired, with kind eyes and a manner that had always put her at ease. They had known each other as children, before the scandal, before the marriage. He had been away in Italy for years, painting and studying. "Lord Croft," she said, surprised, "I did not know you had returned to England." "Only last month." He stepped closer. "I heard about the fate and could not resist seeing Thornwood again. And you—" his gaze swept over her face with gentle scrutiny. "You look well, Evelyn." The childhood nickname caught her off guard. She smiled, a genuine smile she hadn't planned. "Thank you, it has been a busy season." "So I see. I've heard stories of the Duchess who mends roofs and chases mill thieves. They are calling you the Thornwood Angel in the village." She laughed, the sound light and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Exaggerations, I assure you." They spoke for a few minutes, reminiscing about shared memories, avoiding the darker topics. Nathaniel had a way of listening that made her feel seen. When he finally kissed her hand and said good night, she walked inside feeling lighter than she had in weeks. From an upper window, Alexander watched the entire exchange. He had come looking for her to offer something. He wasn't even sure what, an acknowledgement perhaps. Instead, He saw Lord Croft holding his wife's hand a moment too long, saw her smile at Croft with a warmth she had never once directed at him. The jealousy that had been a spark now roared into a flame. His knuckles whitened against the window frame. Croft, Nathaniel Croft, the painter, the wanderer who had known her as a girl, a man with no dark history between their families, no chains of duty and resentment, a man who could make her laugh. The thought was unbearable. He turned from the window, his heart pounding with an emotion he finally had to name: fear. Fear that he had pushed her so far that she was already beyond his reach. The weeks that followed shifted the ground beneath Thornwood Hall. Alexander began to linger. He appeared in doorways where he had no business being. He invented reasons to speak to his wife, trivial questions about the estate, comments on the weather. Each time she answered politely, briefly, and then excused herself. She did not seek his company. She did not ask for his opinion. She simply existed beyond him. Her indifference was a quiet, devastating mirror of his own past coldness. He was living inside the very silence he had created, and it was suffocating. One evening, Nathaniel Croft visited for dinner. He was an old family friend of the Thornwoods distantly, and his request was perfectly proper. Evelina greeted him with visible pleasure. Alexander sat at the head of the table, watching them talk about art and Italy with an ease that excluded him entirely. Every laugh of hers scraped against his nerves. Every glance she gave Nathaniel felt like a tiny betrayal, though he knew, rationally, she owed him no loyalty after the way he had treated her. After dinner, Nathaniel lingered in the drawing room, showing Evelina a small sketchbook. She bent her head close to see the drawings, and Alexander's control snapped. "Lady Thornwood," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "A word." She looked up, startled, then excused herself to Nathaniel with a calm that only inflamed him further. They stepped into the corridor, and he shut the door behind them. "You will not invite him again," Alexander said. Evelina's expression did not change. "I beg your pardon." "Croft, I see the way he looks at you." "He looks at me as a friend," she said quietly, "something you would not recognize." The words hit like a blow. He took a step closer, his voice low and unsteady. "I am your husband." "Yes, you have reminded me of that for 3 years with your absence and your silence. You do not get to claim the privileges of a husband now that another man has shown me basic kindness." There was no anger in her tone, just a terrible, weary honesty. It undid him. "Evelina," he reached for her hand. She pulled away. "Do not," she whispered. "I have spent too long healing to let you break me again." She walked back into the drawing room, head high, and Alexander stood alone in the corridor, his chest heaving with something that felt like grief. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, turning over memories he had long ignored. The way she had looked on their wedding day, nervous and hopeful. The little attention she had tried to give him in the first year, fresh flowers in his study, a book she thought he might like. He had never thanked her. He had never even acknowledged them. He had punished her for existing, and she had done nothing to deserve it. And now she had stopped hoping, stopped trying, stopped loving him. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Dear God, what had he done? The next morning, Evelina left early for the orphanage. She needed the children's chaos to quiet the storm in her heart. She had not cried in months, but last night, after the confrontation with Alexander, she had wept into her pillow until exhaustion claimed her. Not because she loved him, no, she could not afford to love him anymore, but because his sudden attention felt like a cruel joke, too little, too late, when she had finally found a fragile peace. She spent the day scrubbing floors alongside the orphanage matron, playing games with the children, and avoiding her own thoughts. When she returned to Thornwood Hall at dusk, exhausted and dirty, she found Alexander waiting in the entrance hall. He looked terrible. His cravat was undone, his eyes shadowed. He had been waiting for her. "Where have you been?" His voice was hoarse. "The orphanage." He swallowed. "I want to talk, please, Evelina." She was too tired to argue. She nodded and followed him into the small parlor she rarely used. He closed the door and stood before her, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. "I have wronged you," he said. The words were raw, scraped from some deep place. "For 3 years I blamed you for your father's crimes. I was cold and cruel. I made you pay for a sin you did not commit, and I told myself I was justified." She said nothing, only watched him with guarded eyes. "But I was wrong." He took a ragged breath. "You are not your father, you never were, and I have been a fool." Evelina's heart twisted painfully. Why now, Alexander? Because another man smiled at me? No, yes. He closed his eyes briefly. Partly, but mostly because I finally let myself see you. The way you care for people, the way they care for you, I saw what I had thrown away. She turned away from him, walking toward the window. "It has been 3 years. You cannot undo that with a confession." "I know," his voice broke, "but I need you to know that I am sorry, truly sorry, and I know I have no right to ask for anything." She stared out at the darkening garden. The silence stretched thin. "I stopped loving you," she said, the words barely audible. "I had to survive. I don't know if there is anything left to give." He flinched as though she had struck him. "I understand." She finally turned to face him, and for the first time in years she saw him clearly. Not a cold, distant duke, but a man drowning in remorse. The sight moved something inside her, a fragile ember she had thought long dead. "I cannot promise you anything," she said, "but I can promise to try to let you be around. As a friend, perhaps." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "That is more than I deserve." The days that followed were strange and tentative. Alexander did not push. He left small gestures instead of grand ones. A warm shawl draped over her chair on cool mornings, a book of poetry left on her nightstand with no note. He began attending some of her village visits, standing back silently, watching, learning. The tenants were shocked to see their duke. He spoke little, but he listened. Slowly, so slowly, Evelina's heart began to thaw. Not with the burning hope of a girl in love, but with the cautious patience of a woman who had been burned and was learning to trust the warmth again. She still carried her independence like a shield. She still maintained her work, her friendships, her own identity. But she no longer flinched when Alexander was near. One afternoon in late August, Nathaniel Croft came to say goodbye. He was returning to Italy. He found Evelina in the garden, cutting roses. "You seem different," he said, his kind eyes searching her face. "Happier, I think." She smiled softly. "I am finding my way." "And the Duke?" "He is trying." She set down the shears. "It is complicated." Nathaniel took her hand gently. "You deserve to be cherished, Evelyn. If he cannot do that, there are others who would." She squeezed his fingers and let go. "Thank you for being my friend, for reminding me I was worth something." He bowed over her hand, then left, and Evelina watched him go with a bittersweet ache. He had been a lamp in a dark time, but she knew her path led elsewhere. She turned and found Alexander standing at the garden gate, his expression unreadable. He had seen the farewell, but instead of the cold jealousy she expected, he walked toward her slowly and stopped a respectful distance away. "I heard what you said to him," he said quietly, "that you are finding your way." "Yes. Is there room on that path for me?" She looked up at him, this proud, broken man who had shattered her and was now trying, piece by piece, to help her rebuild. The answer came not as a lightning strike, but as a gentle sunrise. "Perhaps," she said, "if you walk beside me, not ahead, if you let me lead sometimes." "I will," he said, his voice thick, "always." The full truth came out 3 days later, and it changed everything again. An old letter was discovered in a hidden compartment of the library desk, a letter from the late Lord Ashworth, Evelina's father, to the previous Duke of Thornwood. It had been hidden for years. Alexander found it while searching for estate records. He read it with trembling hands, then brought it to Evelina. "Your father did not betray mine," he choked out. He was trying to protect him. The embezzlement was done by another lord, a man named Redmond. Your father discovered it and warned my father in this letter, urging him to expose Redmond before the crown discovered all. But Redmond found out and framed your father before he could act. My father died believing your family was to blame because he never saw this letter. Evelina read the words, her father's handwriting, the desperate plea for an alliance, the proof of innocence. Tears slipped down her cheeks, years of shame and shadow lifted in an instant. He was innocent, she whispered, all this time. And I hated you for nothing. Alexander's voice was raw with self-loathing. I built a prison for you on a lie. She looked at him through her tears. The past could not be erased, the pain would not vanish overnight, but the truth burned away the last wall between them. We were both trapped in that lie, she said. We can choose now to be free of it. He knelt before her, not as a duke, but as a man. I will spend the rest of my life making amends. I cannot give you back those 3 years, but I can give you every day I have left. I love you, Evelina. I think I have loved you for a long time, and I was too proud to see it. She reached out and touched his face, tracing the lines grief and regret had carved there. The ember in her heart flared into a steady flame. I am not the girl who married you, she said. I am stronger now, and I think maybe I can love you too, but as the woman I have become. He covered her hand with his own. That woman is the one I want, the only one. Autumn painted Thornwood Hall in amber and gold. The harvest brought a new kind of bounty, not just of grain and fruit, but of tentative smiles and shared evenings by the fire. Alexander began helping Evelina with her charitable work, and together they built a new wing on the orphanage. They argued sometimes about plans and priorities, but the arguments ended in compromise, not cold silence. One evening, walking through the village after a celebration, a child darted up and handed them both a wilted flower crown. Evelina laughed and placed it on Alexander's head, and he let her, to the villagers' delight. The great stone duke, wearing a crown of daisies, bowed to his Duchess with a smile that reached his eyes. In the privacy of their garden that night, he pulled her gently into his arms and rested his chin on her hair. I thought I had lost you, he murmured. You nearly did, she replied, her cheek against his chest, but I chose to stay. Why? She lifted her head and met his gaze. Because you gave me the space to heal, because you saw me, because, despite everything, my heart never quite learned how to stop loving you. He kissed her forehead with a tenderness that spoke of reverence, of gratitude, of promises kept. I will see you every day, he whispered. For the rest of my life I will see you. And he did. The seasons turned. Thornwood Hall, once a house of echoes, filled with warmth. The Duke and his Duchess became known not just for their estate, but for their partnership. She never stopped being the Thornwood angel, and he became the Duke who listened, though he would always say she had taught him how. The past never fully vanished. Their love was built over its ruins, stronger for the cracks. They carried their scars like maps of where they had been, guiding them toward a future neither had dared to imagine. And in that future there was laughter, shared purpose, quiet understanding, and a love that had been tested by fire and found not wanting. Evelina would sometimes stand on the terrace where she had once whispered her surrender to loneliness, and she would breathe in the night air, full of hope. She had stopped waiting for love, and in the letting go, had found it waiting for her all along.